Welcome to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. My name is Daniel Murphy, and I am assistant editor of the Journal. If you are new to these podcasts, please visit the Florida Historical Quarterly on Facebook, where you can now access abstracts of each article in the current issue of the Journal. In 2017, the FHQ is completing its publication of a series of 6 special issues in recognition of the quincentennial of Ponce de Leon's first visit to Florida in 1513. Our next special issue, covering Florida history during the 20th century, will be guest edited by Gary Mormino, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of South Florida at St. Petersburg. Please look forward to publication of this issue in 2017. Today's podcast features an interview with Judith Poucher, Professor Emerita from Florida State College. In the interview, Dr. Poucher and I discuss her article titled The Evolving Suffrage Militancy of Mary Nolan, which was published in the fall 2016 issue of the Florida Historical Quarterly. Please introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a little bit about your academic background.
Okay, my name's Judith Poucher. I'm from Jacksonville, although not from Jacksonville originally. I'm originally from a small town in South Central Florida, so I'm a fifth-generation native Floridian. My PhD is from FSU, PhD in Humanities, and the bulk of my teaching was done at Florida State College at Jacksonville. I taught there for 26 years, taught Florida history, the freshman research course, and some women's history, women's literature, and some humanities. So quite a variety, but towards the end mostly Florida history. I published a book in 2015 called State of Defiance, and then it's got some long scholarly title that I can't quite remember, but it is about the Johns Committee. And it won an award in 2015. It won the Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore Award from the Florida Historical Society. So that's my background.
Excellent, and a great book, to say the least. Well, tell us about this upcoming article. It's about to be published in the FHQ. Just can you give us an overview of it?
Sure, no problem. What started all this was actually kind of an outgrowth of being in Jacksonville. The article is about a woman named Mary Nolan, and for anyone in Jacksonville who's a member of Jacksonville Now, National Organization for Women, if you've been around any time at all in Jacksonville, you'll know about Mary Nolan Day, which Jacksonville Now does every year on August 26th, which is officially nationwide called Equality Day, the day that women won suffrage in the United States. So she's been there in the background, in the back of my mind for a few years. And once I finished my book, that was sort of something on the back burner, and I began to investigate her a little bit more. And what really drew me in was, I think, first of all, was her age and what she'd done. She was 73 years old, apparently very petite. She had what she described as a lame foot, so she was partially disabled. And yet, despite all that, she was arrested for fighting for suffrage. So I wanted to know more about her. So the article first goes into her background, a little bit about what she had done before the suffrage movement came to Jacksonville, essentially, and her background generally, and also kind of where she fit in as a recruit of the National Woman's Party. And then the next section of my article deals with what she did, which was she and, of course, a number of other suffragists in the National Woman's Party, which is usually when you say National Woman's Party, people think of Alice Paul. But that group, the militant group, she was involved in their picketing of the White House and also some later demonstrations at the White House. And she was arrested and went to prison. She was actually arrested 9 times and went to jail 3 times. And she was actually arrested twice in one day. So this is a very active woman. Then the article goes on, the central part of the article then goes on to analyze and discuss an article that she wrote called That Night of Terror. And she published this a few days after she was released from Occoquan prison in Virginia, which was a really bad place to be. And so I spend part of the time analyzing the significance of that night of terror. And then the rest of the article is about what she did later after that and some other activities that she was involved in. So that's generally how the article is, how it goes.
Well, readers, when they get to read the article, they're going to find Mary Nolan to be really fascinating. I know I did. I mean, it's just in so many ways she seems not of her time. But what did you conclude about her? What did you conclude about her activism, and what kind of evidence did you use to determine this?
Well, actually, one of the first conclusions, I'm going to talk about the conclusions now, not necessarily in order of importance, but one of the first conclusions I reached was just that she was not of her time in many ways, that she was atypical. I looked at her in relation to other women who had joined the National Woman's Party, and was asking myself, okay, does she fit sort of not necessarily the stereotype, but maybe the profile, and according to which sources you look at, the profile for actually there's one source that profiles them year by year, which is kind of nice. The typical profile for 1917, which is when she joined the National Woman's Party, the typical recruit would be in her 20s, early 30s, and of course Nolan was 73. Typical recruit would be from the Northeast, and of course Nolan was not. She was from the South. And let's see, what was the other thing besides the Northeast and the South? Oh, and the typical recruit was college educated, and Nolan was not, although she did go to a convent school, but she did not go on to college. So she was atypical in that sense. And even when I narrowed it down and I looked at, for example, Elna Green's work called Southern Strategy, she analyzed and came up with demographic information on 800 suffragists in the South. And some of the things that she came up with, of course, overlapped with the profile I've already given, but in addition to that, she found that most Southern suffragists were Baptist or Methodist, but Nolan was Catholic. And another thing that Elna Green discovered was that most Southern suffragists tended to belong to one or two types of organizations, but with Nolan, she belonged to political organizations and civic organizations and a variety of, like the Red Cross, for example. She worked in this Southern Library movement, helped establish a library in South Carolina. So she didn't fit the profile. And I based that, like I said, on Elna Green's work and also a contemporary source called Jailed for Freedom, written by Stevens, and right now I can't think of her first name, Doris Stevens. And then another work by Ford, which looks at some of the data for the typical recruit in the northeastern part of the country. And of course, above all, the main source for all of this turned out to be the National Woman's Party papers, which are, of course, at the Library of Congress. So that meant I had to go to Washington last summer and work at the Library of Congress, which was absolutely wonderful. So that was my evidence for that conclusion. And another conclusion I came to was how important Nolan's article was. And this is her article, That Night of Terror. And a discussion of it is really the central part of my article. So I think it was important because it helped the National Woman's Party in writing that and in publishing it. Nolan took on the issue of militancy, which is an issue that the National Woman's Party was dealing with because they were being accused of being militant, which they were. She also took on in her article the abuse that women suffered at Occoquan Prison, and also, of course, publicizing that abuse then in turn. And she also wrote about how the abuse they went through created a kind of esprit de corps or group identity for them. So all of that, came. You can see all of that in her article, That Night of Terror. But even more importantly, that one night, which was November 14th, 1917, would come to be called the Night of Terror by suffragists at that time, and it is still called that today by suffragist scholars. So she gave that night its name, so to speak. And I based that just on an analysis of the document itself, and also looked at what some other scholars had said about some other suffragist writing. And then another conclusion I came to was that Night of Terror has been grossly overlooked by scholars. I looked at, of course, my own analysis, and then again looking at through the work by other scholars. It's either not used when they're talking about the Night of Terror, or in a few cases, they do use Nolan's article. Some scholars have done that, but they sometimes don't even give her credit, don't give her name, or don't give the title of the article. So I think it's not been treated very fairly by scholars. And then there was one final conclusion, that it's a small conclusion that I came to, and that was that other people that have written about the Night of Terror and about the suffragists who went through that group of NWP members, other people who've written about that have noted Mary Nolan, of course, because she's so dramatic. Usually they have a sentence or two about her, but really they're talking about the group as a whole most of the time. But they will usually say in passing that when she was sentenced to prison, her sentences were always lenient, which they were. And they would give as the reason for the leniency her age. So they would just, that was it. Oh, well, it was lenient because she was 73 years old. And, in fact, one of the judges did say to her something to the extent that he was a little concerned to sentence her to any prison time at all because of her age. Well, I looked into that a little bit more in using the National Woman's Party papers. And if you look into it a little bit more, you see that, there was talk about her age, but in many instances, she was, in at least 3 incidents, when she's brought into court, the court just goes into chaos because all the suffragists are cheering for her because she's very popular with the suffragists, and she's also very popular with the crowds that come to watch the suffragists. So basically, she disrupts the courtroom. So I think that it wasn't just because of her age; it was because that she embarrassed the judges. And in 2 incidents, they actually changed the date that she was supposed to appear in court and made it earlier. And I think they did that so that the other suffragists would not be there to create chaos in the courtroom. And in one instance, there were, I think, 4 suffragists who were charged with contempt of court just because of that. So, that's my theory, that there was a little bit more to it than that. And that goes back to, I used the contemporary sources for that, like the newspapers of the time, and also memoirs by Doris Stevens, and then another one by Inez Irwin. She wrote a memoir that was published a few years after, the events happened. She was there. So I used, a variety of sources to get to that conclusion. So that's what I came up with.
Well, so she was very popular in suffrage circles, or women's suffrage circles. Do you get any indication of what she thought personally about suffrage? Did her views correspond with everyone else's in the groups, or did she have different ideas on women and how they should vote?
I think in some ways she was even more radical than some of the members of the National Woman's Party, particularly the members of the National Woman's Party who did not go to prison, because obviously if you're willing to go to prison for what you believe, that makes you a more radical than the woman who is a member but who doesn't maybe participate in the protest. So she wrote to Alice Paul once and said something to the effect that we must be free or die. So, that's pretty dramatic. And she liked to sign her letters as the oldest picket, Mary Nolan. And Alice Paul referred to her as the oldest picket as well. So in a few ways, she was probably more radical than some of the members of the NWP in some ways.
The oldest picket. I like that.
Yeah, I like that too.
Well, as far as what she did, I mean, did many people know about her, say in Jacksonville at the time, and then is she, as far as her the long-term effect of what she did, can you trace that to the present, or has she kind of vanished from memory?
Yes and no. As far as people in Jacksonville at the time, yes, she made the newspapers, so they knew about what she was doing. So that's kind of nice. As far as the more long term, I think her story and the Florida suffrage story itself is really, excuse me, it's an example of kind of a chronic problem that we have still with Florida history, which is that there's the idea, first of all, just with the general public, that, Florida doesn't really have a lot of history. It's just about the beaches or whatever. But even with scholars, there's, Florida's the different state, as V.O.K. said back in 1949. I think anybody who writes a book about Florida history is apparently required at some point in the book to quote V.O.K. But anyway, so I think this is just another example of that. There's very little that has been written about suffrage in Florida. Just a few articles, and actually, maybe 2 or 3. But I think the latest one was published in the Quarterly, as it happens, I think in 1978. So there needs to be probably, more work done on just the Florida NWP, the Florida National Woman's Party. I cover some of that in the article, but I don't go into it in great detail just because of, space limitations, and also because I wanted to focus more on Mary Nolan, of course. So, more long-term, I think in terms of Nolan's article, That Night of Terror, I just think it's been overlooked, and I think it needs to be included in studies of Southern suffrage or in studies of suffrage writings and things like that. I think it needs to be put into the canon, in other words. I just think it's so important, and yet it's so very little used. And probably part of that is because it is the only suffrage prisoner narrative written by a Floridian. So in most studies of suffrage, you don't get a lot of information about Florida. So I guess scholars that have been writing, for example, about Southern suffrage, they don't give you a lot about Florida, so therefore they're not going to use Nolan. I think that's probably what's happened in the past in any case. So, I'm trying to kind of, at the very least, I want to prevent her from falling through the cracks of history, which I think I've done just with this one article about her. But I also think, too, that there's an argument to be made for going back and looking more at what was happening in Florida in terms of suffrage, particularly the National Woman's Party. Some of what has been published about Florida suffrage is strictly or almost entirely about the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA for short, which of course is the non-militant group. So that would be the argument that I would make.
Well, great. I agree with you, and this is a really this article tells you a great deal about women's suffrage and really Florida during the period you cover. Judith, thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Oh, no problem. Not at all. It was fun talking to y'all.
Thank you for joining our international audience for this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. The Florida Historical Quarterly is the peer-reviewed scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in the state of Florida. The Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the journal are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you have enjoyed the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast and that you will consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. We also invite researchers to access back issues of the Florida Historical Quarterly on JSTOR. Thank you again for listening to the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast. If you enjoy listening to this interview and know of others who enjoy history, please tell them about the podcast and have them find us on Facebook.